Medieval peasants had a terrifying hierarchy of famine foods that determined who lived and who died during harvest failures. The third tier was so disturbing that most people today would choose starvation instead. But here's what's really shocking. Some of these desperate choices actually saved more lives than you'd think possible. Medieval farmers woke up every morning playing the world's deadliest lottery. No scratch-off tickets or lucky numbers here, just pure survival roulette with Mother Nature holding all the cards. Their entire livelihood depended on weather patterns more unpredictable than a teenager's mood swings. One day, the sun would shine perfectly, promising golden wheat fields stretching to the horizon. The next morning, torrential rain would turn those same fields into muddy graveyards for their crops. Excessive rainfall was like having that one friend who never knows when to leave the party. It just kept going and going, drowning precious seeds and rotting grain right in the ground. Farmers would watch helplessly as months of backbreaking work disappeared under pools of standing water. But the drought was equally merciless. Picture spending weeks nurturing delicate seedlings only to watch them shrivel up like forgotten raisins under a relentless sun. No amount of prayer or hard work could squeeze water from cloudless skies. Then there were those surprise frost attacks. Spring would arrive fashionably early, tricking farmers into planting their crops. Everything looked promising until winter decided to make one last dramatic appearance, freezing tender shoots overnight. Talk about nature's cruelest practical joke. The panic that followed a failed harvest wasn't just about missing a few meals. Entire villages faced the terrifying reality of empty granaries stretching into the unknown future. Food scarcity could drag on for months, sometimes years. Makes our modern grocery store shortages look like minor inconveniences, doesn't it? Here's the kicker. This wasn't some rare catastrophe that happened once in a lifetime. In many regions, farmers expected to lose their entire harvest every 4 or 5 years, every 4th or 5th year. That's like knowing your car will definitely break down every few years, except instead of calling a mechanic, you might starve. Agricultural success was essentially medieval gambling, except the house always had better odds. Farmers threw the dice each planting season, hoping the weather gods felt generous. Sometimes they won big with abundant harvests. More often than not, they learned why hope can be both a blessing and a curse. These weren't lazy farmers or poor planners. They were hardworking people trapped in an agricultural system where success depended entirely on forces beyond human control. No weather apps, no climate predictions, no backup plans except pure grit and community support. Well, that's not entirely true about backup plans. When those golden wheat fields turned into barren wastelands and the grain stores ran empty, medieval people didn't just sit around waiting for better luck next season. They got creative, really creative. And their survival strategies revealed just how devastating a single failed harvest could become. Not just for individual families, but for entire communities hanging by threads thinner than medieval parchment. When your wheat crop failed in medieval times, you weren't just looking at empty stomachs. You were staring down a social avalanche that could bury entire communities. Here's what nobody tells you about medieval famines. They were basically economic earthquakes with aftershocks lasting years. One bad harvest didn't just mean less bread on the table, it meant your neighbor might start eyeing your chicken coop a little too hungrily. Let's start with the obvious problem: malnutrition. When people couldn't get proper food, their bodies became about as resilient as wet parchment. Disease outbreaks that might normally affect a handful of villagers suddenly swept through entire regions like wildfire. The Black Death? Yeah, it hit hardest in areas already weakened by food shortages. Coincidence? Not likely. But the social chaos was even more dramatic than the health crisis. Crime rates shot up faster than bread prices, and trust me, bread prices climbed like a monk scrambling up a bell tower. Historical records from places like England show bread costs doubling, sometimes tripling during famine years. Makes our grocery store sticker shock look pretty tame, doesn't it? Well, when you're paying triple for bread that's harder than your grandmother's wooden spoon, tensions rise. Rich folks hoarded grain like dragons hoarding gold, while poor families made decisions that would make your heart break. Selling family heirlooms for a sack of moldy barley became routine business. Then there's the political mess. Local lords found themselves between a rock and a hard place, or should I say, between hungry peasants and empty granaries. They faced angry mobs demanding food they simply didn't have. Some lords opened their personal stores to help their people, Others? They learned firsthand why pitchforks weren't just farming tools. Social structures that seemed solid as stone crumbled faster than stale bread. Marriages were postponed because families couldn't afford dowries. Young people fled to cities, abandoning rural communities that had existed for generations. The phrase fair weather friends probably got invented during one of these famines. And the weird part is how creative desperation made people. Communities that barely spoke to each other before suddenly became best buddies, sharing resources and information about where to find food. Nothing brings neighbors together quite like mutual starvation. Church records from the 1300s show something fascinating. Charitable donations actually increased during famine years, even though people had less to give. Humans being decent to each other when times got tough. Who would have thought? The ripple effects lasted long after the next good harvest came in. Communities remembered which leaders helped and which ones disappeared when things got rough. Social bonds formed during crisis years often lasted decades. But here's where medieval folks really showed their genius. They didn't just sit around waiting for disaster to pass. They got creative about finding food in places you'd never expect. When your carefully tended wheat field looks like a moonscape and your barley has turned to mush, where exactly do you turn for dinner? Well, if you're living in medieval times, you grab a basket and head straight for the woods. Because apparently, Mother Nature had a backup plan all along. The forest became medieval Europe's emergency grocery store. And let me tell you, it was open 24/7 with no checkout lines. Berries hung like tiny jewels from bushes. Nuts fell from trees like nature's own vending machine. Wild greens sprouted everywhere, practically begging to be picked. But here's where it gets interesting. Foraging wasn't just about wandering around hoping to stumble upon something edible. These people knew their woods better than we know our local supermarket aisles. They could spot edible mushrooms from 50 paces and knew which berries would kill you faster than a medieval tax collector. Then there's the water situation. When land-based food disappeared, rivers and lakes suddenly became lifelines. Fish don't care if your wheat crop failed. They just keep swimming around, basically volunteering to become dinner. Clever, really. The community aspect of foraging tells us something fascinating about medieval survival. Entire families would head out together, sharing knowledge passed down through generations. Grandmother knew which roots were safe. Uncle Bob knew where the best nut trees grew. Little Sally had eagle eyes for berry patches. However, this woodland buffet came with serious risks. Get the wrong mushroom and you're meeting your maker. Mistake one plant for another, and suddenly your last meal becomes literally your last meal. Makes you appreciate modern food labels, doesn't it? Some families reportedly survived entire winters on nothing but acorns. Now, if you've ever tasted an acorn, you know it's about as appetizing as chewing on tree bark, which, coincidentally, people also ate during desperate times. But medieval cooks found ways to make even acorns palatable by grinding them into flour and mixing them with whatever else they could find. The really impressive part, communities developed sophisticated foraging schedules. Different families would tackle different areas of the forest, then share their bounty. It was like having a medieval meal-sharing app, except instead of ordering through your phone, you walked 5 miles through muddy woods carrying a wicker basket. This woodland wisdom created something unexpected, stronger community bonds. Nothing brings people together quite like collectively searching for dinner in a forest. When everyone's hungry, social hierarchies tend to blur. The Lord's knowledge of Latin doesn't help much when you need to identify edible plants. But even the most abundant forest couldn't feed everyone indefinitely, which leads us to wonder, what happened when people had leftover food that was starting to go bad? Turns out medieval cooks had some surprisingly clever tricks for making old food new again. When your grain stores ran empty and the markets had nothing left to sell, medieval families didn't just throw up their hands in defeat. They got creative with what they had sitting around, especially that rock-hard bread that could probably double as a medieval doorstop. Stale bread wasn't trash in the Middle Ages, it was a treasure waiting to be transformed. Medieval cooks mastered the art of resurrection cooking, turning yesterday's leftovers into today's lifeline. That crusty loaf that seemed destined for the compost pile, it became the foundation for survival meals that could stretch precious ingredients further than a medieval merchant's promises. The secret weapon was pottage, a thick, hearty stew that could make a single piece of old bread feed an entire family. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of making a gourmet meal from whatever's lurking in your fridge, except the stakes were life and death instead of just avoiding takeout again. Here's where it gets interesting. Medieval cooks would break up that concrete hard bread into chunks and toss it into boiling water with whatever scraps they could find. A bit of bacon fat here, some wilted vegetables there, maybe a bone that had already been gnawed clean twice. The bread acted like a medieval thickening agent, soaking up flavors and turning watery broth into something substantial enough to stick to your ribs. But wait, there's more genius to this system. Different regions developed their own signature pottage styles, turning necessity into culinary tradition. Northern communities might add barley and root vegetables, while southern areas incorporated whatever herbs grew wild nearby. It was like having regional food trucks, except the truck was a communal pot and the specialty was whatever keeps us alive today. The beauty of bread-based pottage lay in its flexibility. Got some cheese rinds, throw them in, found a few eggs, perfect. Managed to catch a fish? Even better. The old bread absorbed everything, creating meals that were surprisingly filling and occasionally even tasty. Medieval housewives became masters of disguise, transforming the same basic ingredients into seemingly different meals day after day. Monday's pottage might taste completely different from Wednesday's, even though both started with the same foundation of recycled bread and determination. This wasn't just about filling empty stomachs. It was about maximizing every crumb when waste meant the difference between survival and starvation. Every piece of bread represented hours of labor, from planting wheat to grinding flour to baking loaves. Throwing away food wasn't just wasteful, it was practically criminal. The ingenuity didn't stop at pottage, though. Medieval cooks discovered that their resourcefulness with leftovers opened doors to entirely new ways of thinking about food itself. Sometimes survival meant looking beyond traditional ingredients altogether. When your main grain supply vanished overnight, medieval bakers became master magicians of substitution. Well, maybe not magicians, but they certainly pulled some impressive tricks out of their flour sacks. Chestnut flour became the golden child of alternative baking. These nuts, abundant in many European forests, could be ground into a surprisingly decent bread substitute. The texture wasn't quite right. Imagine biting into what you thought was a dinner roll, but getting something closer to a dense cake. Still, it filled bellies and didn't taste like cardboard, which was already a victory. Pea flour joined the party next. Ground dried peas created a greenish bread that probably looked like it belonged in a modern health food store. The irony? What we now pay premium prices for as alternative grain bread was once the food of desperate people. Makes you wonder who's really getting the better deal, right? Then things got creative in ways that would make survival show contestants nervous. Ground acorns entered the mix, though they required serious preparation. Raw acorns contain bitter tannins that'll pucker your mouth faster than a lemon eating contest. Medieval cooks learned to soak and rinse them repeatedly, leaching out the bitterness until they became edible. This process took days, but hunger has a way of making people very patient. But here's where desperation met genuine ingenuity. Bark bread. Yes, actual tree bark. Pine bark, specifically, was ground and mixed with whatever real flour remained. The result was about as appetizing as it sounds, like chewing on a forest floor. Yet people survived on it, proving that humans will literally eat wood before giving up. The weird part is how these substitute breads sparked heated debates. Village bakers argued over what qualified as real bread during lean times. Some refused to call chestnut loaves actual bread, insisting they were merely grain-shaped imposters. Others embraced the creativity, developing recipes that actually improved these alternatives. Local variations emerged based on regional resources. Coastal areas experimented with ground seaweed mixed into dough. Mountain communities tried crushed pine needles for flavor. Each region developed its own survival cuisine, born from necessity, but shaped by local ingenuity. These alternative flours often lacked the nutritional punch of wheat or barley. People stayed hungry even while eating, their bodies craving nutrients these substitutes couldn't provide. The bread filled space in stomachs, but left nutritional gaps that caused weakness and illness. Yet something remarkable happened through this culinary desperation. Recipes evolved, techniques improved, and some alternative breads became genuinely good. Communities that initially grimaced at chestnut bread eventually developed versions people actually requested. The real miracle wasn't just making inedible things edible, it was transforming survival into sustainability. These weren't temporary fixes, but evolving food traditions. However, bread substitutes were only part of the survival puzzle during failed harvests. Medieval communities also mastered another crucial strategy that kept entire villages alive. When your grain stores ran empty and the vegetables rotted in flooded fields, there was one food that laughed in the face of time itself: cheese. Medieval folks weren't just making cheese for fun, they were creating edible insurance policies. A well-made wheel of hard cheese could last months, sometimes even a year, without spoiling. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of having money in the bank, except this bank account was delicious and didn't charge fees. But here's where it gets interesting. Cheese wasn't just about lasting power, it was incredibly nutritious. While people were gnawing on bark bread and watery pottage, a chunk of aged cheese delivered concentrated protein, fat, and calcium. One small piece could provide more nutrition than a bowl of grain soup. Pretty smart for people who supposedly lived in the Dark Ages, right? Then there's the whole world of fermented foods that kept medieval communities from starving. Sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented dairy products weren't just tasty, they were lifesavers. The fermentation process didn't just preserve food, it actually made it more nutritious by creating beneficial bacteria and vitamins. Well, let's not forget that medieval people figured out fermentation without understanding a single thing about bacteria or chemistry. They just knew that cabbage left in salt brine somehow stayed good all winter, while fresh cabbage turned to mush. Trial and error at its finest. Monasteries became the real heroes of food preservation. These religious communities often maintained massive cheese cellars and fermentation rooms. When harvest failures hit, monks would distribute their stored wheels to hungry villagers. It was like having a medieval food bank, except the bankers wore robes and sang prayers while handing out aged cheddar. The weird part is how different regions developed their own preservation specialties. Northern communities perfected techniques for fermenting fish and dairy. Southern areas focused on preserved vegetables and fruits. Each region's survival foods reflected what grew locally and what preservation methods worked best in their climate. But fermentation did more than just prevent spoilage. It transformed inedible ingredients into palatable meals. Tough, bitter vegetables became tangy, soft delicacies through fermentation. Milk that might have spoiled became nutritious cheese that improved with age. Medieval households treated their fermentation vessels like family heirlooms. Clay pots and wooden barrels were passed down through generations, each one seasoned with beneficial bacteria cultures that made better and better preserved foods over time. Losing your fermentation equipment was almost as devastating as losing your cooking pots. Makes sense, right? When you can't rely on fresh food year-round, you become an expert at making food that gets better with time rather than worse. And the brilliant thing about preserved foods, they didn't just feed individual families, they became the foundation for something even more powerful in times of crisis. You know what's funny about modern potlucks? We stress about bringing the perfect dish, worried someone might judge our casserole. Well, medieval folks had their own version of community dining, except the stakes were life or death rather than social embarrassment. When harvests failed and individual families faced starvation, communities quickly learned that sharing meager resources wasn't just nice, it was essential for survival. Local lords and church leaders often organized communal meals, pooling whatever food remained in the area. Think of it as the world's most serious dinner party, where everyone brought whatever they could scrape together. These weren't fancy feasts by any stretch. Picture a gathering where one family contributed their last handful of barley, another brought some dried fish, and someone else showed up with foraged mushrooms that hopefully weren't poisonous. The result? A communal pot of whatever we can find stew that kept entire villages alive. But here's where it gets interesting. These community meals did more than just fill empty stomachs. They became psychological lifelines during the darkest months. When you're facing potential starvation alone, despair creeps in fast. When you're sharing that struggle with your neighbors, suddenly survival feels possible again. Church records from the 13th century show that almsgiving, basically medieval charity, increased dramatically during famine years. Monasteries became food distribution centers, doling out bread to long lines of hungry villagers. Makes sense, right? Religious institutions typically had better storage and more reliable food reserves than individual families. The wealthy weren't exempt from this community responsibility either. Noble families faced enormous social pressure to open their stores during famines. A lord who let his peasants starve while his granaries remained full might find himself dealing with angry mobs rather than grateful subjects. Smart nobles understood that a few months of generous sharing beat years of potential rebellion. And the weird part is, these crisis-born community meals often strengthened social bonds permanently. Families who shared their last crust of bread with neighbors created relationships that lasted generations. Some historians argue that medieval communities were actually more tightly knit than modern ones, partly because they regularly faced these shared survival challenges. Local leaders developed surprisingly sophisticated distribution systems. They'd assess each household's remaining food, calculate how many mouths needed feeding, then organize rotating meal schedules to stretch resources as far as possible. It was like medieval meal planning, except the consequences of poor math meant people died. Then there's the practical genius of communal cooking. Heating one large pot for 50 people used far less precious firewood than 50 individual cooking fires. Every stick of wood saved meant more for heating homes during brutal winter months. These community tables weren't just about food distribution, they were about maintaining hope when everything seemed hopeless. Because sometimes survival isn't just about calories. Sometimes it's about sitting with your neighbors and remembering you're not facing the darkness alone.